Good afternoon and welcome again to our series of webinars on the doctoral research by Dr. David Lowe. And we've been looking at a number of key issues that turn up in coaching. And today's subject is about inquiry. So I'm really curious about how this is going to shape up. What did you find in your findings, David, on the question of inquiry?
So, welcome everyone again. Well, in the analysis of the research, inquiry emerged as the place where humour was most visibly evidenced, and particularly where most visible where it influenced some cognitive movement within the client. So, participants in the research repeatedly described humour as reducing pressure and enhancing clarity of thought. So one of the phrases was that humor softens everything and helps the coach do their good thinking. Was one from Stephen. So importantly, and as we'll talk about as we go through this, inquiry refers not just to questioning, but the broader process of inquiry. So one of the phrases is it moves from pre-reflective experience into conscious awareness, so that we're actually bringing what's going on to the fore of the client's mind, and then also looking to see if there's some alternative meanings that comes up as well. So if we go back to my original image, I'm going to add a picture here. No, I'm going to add the wrong picture here. There we go. These were the four areas that I identified as this is what coaching is. And within the area of inquiry, I split it into clarifying, into exploration, and into challenge. So they were the three areas that I identified within coaching. And then when we looked into humor, I found that humor came into all of those three. So it was very much present in the research. For the analysis and for coherence, I grouped them into two rather than three. So whereas we had exploration, clarification, and challenge in my coaching definition of what is coaching in terms of inquiry, I put them into clarification. So all the things around understanding or the client understanding what's going on. And then the second category was about gaining alternative perspective. So that included challenge very much.
Okay, then. So if we start with clarification as the first of the groups or labels that you found in your research, how did that show up?
So there were a number of areas. I'm going to pick out some most interesting ones, or ones that I think are most pertinent to our viewers. So two particularly came out for this clarification part. First, humor was used as what I've called a demystifying device. And then secondly, it was used very much as a reflective mirror. So taking this demystifying to start with, participants described humor as being able to translate abstract or emotionally dense material into layman's speak, right? So they were able to take what was complex or that they were struggling to explain, or that was taking a lot of cognitive power, they were having to think a lot about it, or that was very heavy in emotion. And so they could use humor in order to reduce the emotion, reduce the cognitive load, reduce the perceived threat, if you like, as well, and the complexity of it as well. So from one point, it would reduce that emotion, and it would help make things less opaque, right? And so the phrase that I used earlier was from Elaine Cox in her writing on coaching. She defined the inquiry phase, although she called it something different. I'm using my phrasing now. The inquiry phrase as shifting the thinking from pre-reflective awareness. So this is what we know before we've actually thought about it into this conscious state, so where we can actually articulate it. And so this came across as things like being able to hear what the client hear what they're saying, but in a different way. Right? And so we know, as coaches, we know things. The techniques for this are things like paraphrasing and mirroring. And when coaches replayed the client's words using like irony, for example, or emphasize something, maybe a tone in the voice, or used a word that the client had used frequently, it helped them do things like recognize contradictions, or where the client was being incongruous with other things they've said or talked about in the past, and realizing when they'd said something that just didn't fit with what had gone on before. So that kind of incongruous, I've said this, but now I've said this, and using humor in order to play that back was quite useful. So again, I've explained this I've explained this in the past few webinars, that we're not talking a joke. We're not talking high amusement, and these are very subtle uses of humor, but being able to identify that we're using humor in order to change or redefine the meaning of it. So it helped clients look at their own language as well sometimes, and and realize that what they were saying was sometimes humorous in whatever way. As I said before, maybe it was incongruous with what they'd said previously. So there was also some use of humor where one of the participants said it was a bit like having an epiphany. Right? So it wasn't always clear when they were in the moment, but when we looked back at the recordings that we'd done, so I did a coaching session which we recorded with the client, and then we watched it back. Although they didn't recognize it at the time, when we were watching it back or after they'd done the session and they referred back to it, it was that the humor, the levity had helped them have that insight. So it helped them realize the incongruousness or whatever, incongruity or whatever it wasn't always in the moment, but the humor helped it, and then they realized later on that had happened. So there's various phrases, but it's a bit like putting a wedge in a rock where you've kind of got that little break, and you're sliding some kind of, I can't remember the phrase, but like a chisel in between, and it's just a tiny little fracture in it that allows the humor to enter, and then it kind of breaks it apart for the client. So it allows that new reinterpretation, if you like.
Yeah, it's wonderful the way that you've been explaining that, and it's really resonating with me in how humor and coaching have this similarity, in that when we're working on inquiry, quite often what we're trying to do with our clients is to shift perspectives, look at the same thing in a different light or from a different direction, so that new meanings can emerge. And that's very much what we see in humor as well. It's about the switch of perspective or meaning making that makes the joke. I mean, thinking about the horse walks into the bar and the barman says, "Why the long face?" And the long face is for a horse, or the long face is for somebody being depressed. And that just kind of shifting of context and viewpoint is what creates humor. It makes us laugh. And also we're looking for that kind of aha or even laughter maybe moment for when we switch the perspective, and then suddenly the new meaning emerges. Like you say, getting that wedge into the rock, and the humor being the thing that splits it and allows the new meaning to emerge. I can really see how this is a very valuable way to use humor.
That was the one side with that, the clarification, if you like, and then we had the other side, which was the challenge. And we'll come to, I'm suspecting a few people are thinking, well, oh, but there's some challenges in that, or there's potential problems in that, and we'll come to those later.
Yes, yes. So for your second label, let's say, was about challenge and humour and challenge. I'm really interested to hear what you found there and how humour was being used.
Yeah, and this is an area that I think lots of people, if you said the use of humour in coaching, I think a lot of people would jump to this challenge as maybe, you know, the thing that they think about first. So it was, in terms of those challenges, or those, I'll stop using the word challenge in multiple things, in multiple ways. The problem that was often thought about is, when is it okay to use challenge in humour? And so, as I said, we'll come back to that. But one thing, when the support was there, so when the client and the coach had already built that element of support, that relational safety, then humour was seen as something that was fine to use. Again, there's some exceptions, and we'll come back to those later. But yeah, it was really important of having that relationship. Now, that doesn't necessarily need to take a long time. We've already talked about the fact that the relationship seems to build quite quickly in terms of having enough of supporting relationship in order to bring in humour. But it was important to have that support there, and without it, there's big challenges. So humour, even, I keep going back to the problems with it, but even when humour was quite a risk, that this support use seemed to mitigate against that risk. So yeah, it was that kind of buffer to give some allowance for this humour. So the quite expected things maybe came out of it were that challenge, humour for challenge was used in things like juxtaposition. So putting one thing against something else that is unexpected. And this comes back to a fundamental theory of humour, which is incongruity theory. So we've got one mental model, and the punchline, well, best explained with a joke that I use is, and I've said this before, so it's getting very unfunny now the more I use it, but why did the scarecrow win an award? You've got these mental models of scarecrows and awards, and then the punchline is because he was outstanding in his field. And so that then resolves that incongruity, that contradiction between those two things. So juxtaposition is very common in humour, and bringing that into the coaching world, so that we're showing something that is very unexpected next to each other, is very common. Exaggeration. So the client might say something, again, I'm not saying these would be uses in a coaching session, or that they were from the research participants, but, you know, I'm no good at maths. Yeah, okay, I mean, I struggle to do 1 add 1, right? So it's that exaggeration of either a lot more or a lot less in something. And then we go into the absurd and fantasy as well, which just takes the client again out of that current situation and allows them to see it from a different perspective, along with highlighting irony sometimes as well. And so they kind of displaced the current situation. So this is how the client thinks about something, or this is how the client is thinking about something. And challenge just allowed it to kind of just fracture that, jolt it a little bit, so that they could see it in a different way. And they used words like popping a bubble, stepping outside the situation, and it allowed them to kind of laugh at the situation that they were in without it feeling that we were laughing at them. Right? They were laughing at the situation, not at the client. So it didn't seem to undermine the client, but it destabilized their thinking in it, or that rigidity of belief, for example. Ridiculousness was a quite popular one as well. Again, clients using this. A lot of the challenge comes from the coach, but there was also some coming from the client. So they would often, in the research, there were multiple instances of where the client would say, go into something that was a ridiculous again, either exaggeration or just a fantasy that couldn't exist regarding the situation. And so they took it into that absurd level to kind of to expose their assumptions, inconsistencies, patterns that they were coming up with, things like that. And sorry, if someone can hear a grumble, it's because the dog is under my desk and he's just getting comfortable. It's not my stomach or anything else.
Not hearing it, David. You can rest
Good.
assured.
Well, I just wanted to check because people can, when it's recorded, people can replay it and say, was that my end or was that David's? But no, it was definitely the dog, I promise you. So the exaggeration of things or taking something to an extreme allowed clients to identify what was actually the underlying situation. By taking the extreme, that they would then highlight the potential problem or the cause of something, for example.
Yeah. So that's an excellent exploration of the findings that you saw. You've kind of foreshadowed right from the beginning of this session that this is a potentially precarious situation. So tell us more about tensions and paradoxes that you come across.
And this is fundamentally under the whole research. I think probably why it started as well. I was identified that I didn't use humor as much in my coaching practice as I did in other aspects of, say, training or facilitation. And I suppose my concept at the back of my mind was, is this because I'm worried about the problems it might bring up? Right? And so, there are obviously problems. And again, often within this challenge. So I think I'm less concerned about it in relationship building. I'm less worried about it in support. But in challenge, it can easily become a problem, right? There's a big difference between gentle irony and cutting sarcasm. So it's less in the content and it's more in things like tone and timing. And we'll come to timing later. That's another can of worms. But with the tone, as we all know, right? We know that when someone sends us an email, we can really take offense at something, which isn't meant because we've not got tone in an email, or we're implied tone, right? Or we're judging what the tone is in an email. Whereas if we actually heard them, if they left us a voice note, although I hate voice notes, but if they left us a voice note, we'd be able to pick up that tonal difference, right? Tone can really have a lot of problems, that causing an offense to someone, having a fracture in our relationship, eroding their psychological safety, things like that. There's also some more unexpected concerns that the research participants had. One was about, is the use of humor by the coach drawing attention away from the client and more towards the coach's performance? So is it more putting the spotlight on the coach rather than the client? Does it disrupt the listening from the coach? Does it change the focus from what the client is talking about to the focus on the humor? Things like that. So there was a lot of reflection from the coach participants in the research about, is this really for the client? Is this really for the best of the client? One of the coaches said, there was a clear example that he had, because I asked them to journal. And one of the reflections was, there was clearly a point in one of his coaching sessions where he was thinking about adding some humor into it, and he missed the opportunity for a really important coaching question. It would have been much better to have asked the question. And so in some instances, is it taking that focus away, the coach's focus away? So you could say it's a tool for good, as we've talked about before, but also is it a tool that can distract as well? So this brought in, there's a lot in this that I'm trying to unpack. Sorry, Linda, I'm not letting you have much of a say today. But timing, judgment, anticipating how the client is going to interpret what we're saying are massive factors in it. And all of that work that's going on in terms of making that humor attempt, right? We're having to think about, do I make it? When do I make it? What might they, how might they receive it? Will they understand it? All of these things which are going on in a split second in our minds, right? One question is this taking valuable cognitive power that we could be using for something else, such as listening? And I use the metaphor of a bit like a computer's processing power, right? It's got a certain amount of CPU, and if we overload it, we kind of get the spinning beach ball of death, right? And we don't want the metaphorical spinning beach ball of death in our minds, right, while we're coaching. So how much effort is going into it seems to be a factor as well. You know, we don't need to have humor necessarily. Again, we'll come to authenticity a little bit later, but what is the benefit that it's bringing and what is the cost in order for us to do that?
I'm thinking about our poor students when we are teaching coaching, and they say, you know, I've got to listen to the client, I've got to notice my own reactions, I've got to look at the space between us, and now I've got to do this as well. It is clearly an additional load, and so maybe something to think about adding in once the coaching confidence is there with the basics.
Yeah. But then again, if it's naturally coming up, and this is the challenge with it. If it naturally comes up, is it easy just to say it without all of that CPU being used? So it's a conversation I had with one of the coaches was, you know, we're both educators, is coach education, and you know, we were saying, should we kind of say, don't think about it to start with, but then if it comes naturally, you're kind of putting a block on it, it's taking more of the energy. So it's a really tricky one to actually give advice on as a coach educator, because again, it could take more effort to stifle it, in effect, right? So it was, but I think you're right. I think it's almost like a competency that certainly if you are not someone who has humor that naturally occurs, spending that massive amount of your mental CPU to try and generate it is probably not the best recommendation. If it's naturally coming up and it's useful for the client, and this is the crux of the whole section here, is if it's useful for the client and it's not taking a massive amount of your cognitive load, then it may well be a useful thing, especially if it's also intrinsic to your identity, that authenticity that keeps popping up. Then it's probably a fair game to start thinking about, should I bring this in? And there's always that, should I bring this in, however deeply you think about it. But if it's a peripheral thing, then maybe you bringing humor into this is something that we're not focusing on. However, as we've said before, in terms of the relationship building, if the client or whoever the other person is bringing humor and you don't respond to it, then that can have negative effects of the speaker, the person who's bringing this humor attempt, can feel that you're being distant and not be a positive relationship builder. So yes, it's tricky, right? It's not, I think our summary is, humor is not a universal requirement for effective inquiry.
Right.
But certain coaches, it feels like an authentic extension of us or part of us, and therefore it does make sense. But that's not where the complexity ends, right, Linda?
Yeah.
Because
I'm going to ask you the question now. What about interruptions?
Yes. Right. This. Yeah, you should have interrupted me instead of that. Would have been even better, right? Yes. So without going too theoretical on this, because we've already spent lots of our available webinar time on this. What are we told when we're new coaches most of the time about interrupting?
Don't do it.
Don't do it, right? There are exceptions, though, that come up. If a client is going round in circles, then we might say, that's a fair time to jump in at some point and just replay what is coming up. Humour, as the old phrase of what's the most important part of humour is timing, right? That humour often does depend on having that immediacy. There's a stimulus, and actually the humour is only funny if it's brought up in that moment, or at least the effect is diminished the longer it takes, right? But then in coaching, we've got that problem that it risks violating the flow of the coaching session. So this is a real practical paradox, and I'm afraid I don't have a silver bullet for this, right? It's this judgment that we're having to bring as the humor attempter, the person bringing the humor. Is that use of humor in that moment going to help the client with that inquiry or whatever it is? We're talking about inquiry today. So, that's quite a judgment to have to make. It built by knowing our client quite well, but there is a risk, of course, of that not working. And so that this is an area that is very tricky. There's no surprise there, right? I'm not bringing anything groundbreaking to there. Humor can be tricky, but specifically in the interruption, is it clarifying something? Is it reflecting something? Is it shifting that frame of how someone's looking at? Is it a way of challenging the client in a humane and kind way? And whatever it is, whether it's a comparison about something or an exaggeration or absurdity or whatever it is, it can bring those soft challenges, that awareness of what is going on, but it can also distract, destabilize trust, all of those other things. So it's maybe one for, as we've said, that competency, once we're feeling that we're getting into a position where we're comfortable with the use of humor, that we might think about interruption. But this is where it gets really gnarly.
Yeah. But again, I think that overarching value of in the service of the client is the thing to lean back on there. Always in the service of the client.
Yes.
Great.
Definitely.
So could you pull those strings together for us as we're coming to the end of our session today?
Yes. Well, and I think this is the culmination of where I've got with it, right? I think it is, for all of these, but especially inquiry, is not should I use humor or should I not use humor? This is not a binary thing. It's more when humor arises in you as the speaker, right? We can't stop other people making humor attempts. So when it's coming up, when it's bubbling up for you, for this topic, does it deepen the inquiry or does it divert the client away from the inquiry that they're already having? And there's lots of methods that it can help, as we've talked about, exaggeration, reframing, all of those things. But is it going to break the train of thought of the client? Is the value more than the cost, I suppose, on this? And that's a judgment that each coach is going to have to make.
Fantastic. Any final words of wisdom you'd like to leave our watchers with today on this subject?
I really wish I had a cracking joke to say at the end of this. I suppose the question is, and it's more a reflection for people who are watching it, it's when you are using humor, what is the trigger for it? When you're using it, especially in inquiry, what is the hope that it's going to bring when you're using humor? And it's probably too much to think about in the moment. So this may be a reflection for your journal afterwards. But what was the aim of the humor and what did it achieve? How much did it cost in terms of stopping the client thinking, stopping them talking, whatever it was? And what was the benefit? How much did it help them deepen that inquiry? So another question for your journaling. That's what I'd encourage.
Fantastic, thank you. So that brings us to the end of the subject today, and we've got one more webinar to go, which is the final part of your findings on the subject of transformation.
We do, yes. So as we talked about, transformation or progress can be seen as a variety of things in coaching. So we're going to talk about those. Some strange findings in that, which we'll talk about next week.
Ooh, strange findings. You've really piqued my interest. So thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the doctoral research of Dr. David Lowe. We'd like to remind you that we are recruiting now for our next cohort of coach education. This is an ICF accredited program which helps you towards the first credential within the ICF, the Associated Certified Coach. And we'd be really pleased to have you join us on that program. So if you're intrigued by the style and the content, please get in touch, and we'd love to see you when we start our next program in March.
Thank you very much, Linda. And we'll see you next week.
And with that, yes, we'll see you next week. Goodbye.